The clang of iron gates slammed through the air like a final sentence, sealing the fate of Aiko Tanaka, 23 years old and worn thin by years of war. The metallic echo followed her as she stepped off the truck, her wrists stiff from the ropes, her eyes burning with exhaustion.
Number 34.
In that moment, she was no longer a daughter of Japan, but a prisoner in a foreign land. Her heart pounded with dread, every lesson drilled into her mind by her superiors repeating like a curse. The Americans would be brutal, she thought. They would strip her dignity, mock her weakness, perhaps even end her life. That was the only future she had allowed herself to imagine. But when she lifted her gaze, expecting snarling guards and filth, she froze. The camp was not a dungeon. Rows of barracks stood neatly aligned, the ground swept clean. Soldiers kept watch, their faces stern, yet not cruel. Beyond the fence, a patch of green caught her eye. A vegetable garden tended by men in uniform, their hands working the soil as they whistled softly to themselves. It was so ordinary, so human, that her breath caught in her throat. For the first time in months, she smelled food, cooking stew, thick with meat, and bread fresh from the ovens. Confusion welled up inside her. This was not what she had been told. Where were the monsters in uniform, the merciless captors? Why did order and kindness replace the chaos she feared? Aiko gripped the edge of her thin blanket later that night, staring into the shadows. Her mind spun with questions she could not answer. Was this a deception, a mask hiding cruelty to come? Or had the world, even in the heart of war, grown more complicated than she dared believe? The first nights inside the camp pressed down on Aiko like a weight she could not shrug off. She lay on a narrow cot with clean sheets that smelled faintly of soap, the soft rustle of fabric against her skin so unfamiliar that it unsettled her more than it comforted her. Every sense was heightened, tuned, to catch the crack of boots on gravel outside the jangle of keys at the barracks door, the murmur of soldiers' voices, in a language she only half understood. She kept waiting for cruelty, for the harsh blow, for the proof that her fears had not been misplaced, and yet it never came. The guards stood watch, but they did not raise their hands against her or the other women. They barked orders with the same rigid tones all armies used, but their eyes held nothing of the hunger she had seen in battlefields, nothing of the cold delight she had imagined Americans would take in her suffering. In the daylight, the camp unfolded with strange clarity. The gravel paths were swept clean, the barracks lined in straight rows, like an orderly village. There was a rhythm to it, all roll call in the morning tasks, assigned meals served with steady regularity. The food shocked her most of all. Bowls of stew thick with meat, slices of bread still warm, fruit whose sweetness almost hurt her tongue after months of hunger. She wanted to spit it out to prove she would not be bought, but her body betrayed her with every greedy swallow. Each bite deepened the confusion clawing at her heart. How could this be war? How could this be prison? When she walked between the barracks, she saw the garden again, a patch of green so alive it made her chest ache. Soldiers knelt in the soil, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. As they pulled weeds, their faces softened by the simplicity of the work. She remembered her mother's garden back home, rows of vegetables carefully tended while bombs thundered miles away. The memory struck like a blade, slicing through her fear with unexpected tenderness. These men, these supposed monsters, whistled tunes while they worked the earth. For a fleeting moment, they did not look like guards at all, but farmers, brothers, sons. The contradictions tore at her. At night, she whispered to the woman beside her that it must be a trick, some cruel manipulation to lower their defenses before the real punishment came. Her voice trembled even as she spoke, because part of her wanted desperately to believe it was not a trick at all. The barracks smelled of soap and wood instead of rot. The guards' hands stayed at their sides instead of on their rifles. The stew filled her stomach instead of twisting it with hunger. Yet the lessons of her youth screamed in defiance. Americans are ruthless. They are demons in human skin. They will destroy you the moment you forget who they are. Each day deepened the conflict. At roll call, she stood stiff. As the interpreter read their names, the gravel biting her bare feet, the sun harsh on her face. She expected a blow if she stumbled over her answer. It never came. When she coughed, the guard beside her glanced, then turned away indifferent, but not cruel. That indifference shook her as much as kindness would have. They saw her, not as prey, not as enemy, but as a task to be managed, a body in their care. It was dehumanizing in its own way, and yet it was safer than she had dreamed. Safety itself became a weapon against her certainty. She tried to cling to the stories that had fed her hatred. She remembered the speeches, the posters, the whispered warnings of officers who told them death was preferable to capture. She told herself she was dishonoring her nation simply by breathing their food-scented air. But her heart refused to bend so easily. When she washed her hands in clean water after a meal, she felt the sting of tears at the corners of her eyes. When she touched the coarse fabric of her new bedding, she wanted to sink into it and forget the nights of mud and cold she had endured. It was not gratitude. It could never be gratitude. But it was a fragile kind of relief that left her guilty and trembling. The women around her wrestled with the same silent questions. Some ate quickly, eyes darting as if expecting the stew to vanish. Others refused to speak their pride, a shield against the comfort. Aiko studied their faces and saw the same confusion mirrored in their expressions. Together they were trapped between two worlds, the one they had been promised and the one they now lived. Between the enemy they had imagined and the human figures moving before them. At night the silence was both gift and torment. She lay awake, listening to the breathing of the women around her, her thoughts circling like restless birds. She thought of her mother's voice, telling her never to trust, never to soften, never to forget her duty to Japan. But she also thought of the soldier's garden, of the soup, thick with meat, of the hands that had not struck her. She turned on her cot, pressing her face into the pillow to hide the tears she could not explain. Each morning when the gates clanged open again, it was as though the world reminded her of her place. The fences glinted with barbed wire, the towers loomed, the rifles never left the soldiers' sides. Freedom was gone. That truth was iron undeniable. And yet within those fences, something unexpected flickered, small, fragile, but alive. Aiko could not name it yet, but it unsettled her more than any cruelty would have. For cruelty she had prepared herself. For this she had no shield. Days stretched into weeks and routine wrapped around her like a net. Every moment became a test of her will to resist comfort, to cling to hatred, to refuse the quiet pull of safety. She scolded herself with every smile she almost allowed, every breath of relief she dared to take. Still the cracks widened. Still she found herself staring at the garden, at the soldiers who worked it at the order that made survival possible. And with each passing day, her heart whispered the question. Her mind refused to speak aloud. What if the world was not as simple as she had been taught? What if everything she believed had been a lie? The days slipped into a rhythm she could to not escape each morning, marked by the clang of the gates and the roll call that lined them up like shadows under the Sunday. Aiko stood stiff among the others, her head bowed, her heart clenched, waiting for the sharp command or the blow that never came. She had told herself over and over that safety was an illusion, that comfort was a trap, yet the order of the camp slowly wore down her defenses. It was within this fragile balance of dread and reluctant relief that she first noticed him. At first, there was nothing remarkable. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, his uniform pressed clean despite the dust that clung to everything. His boots struck the gravel with the same authority as the others. But when he spoke, his voice did not carry the harsh edge she had grown used to. The interpreter translated his words as, "always," yet the tone itself was different, steady, calm, as if he meant to be heard, rather than feared. She tried to ignore it, but her ears betrayed her. His voice lingered long after silence had returned. The first moment came when she coughed during roll call, her chest tight with the lingering sickness she had carried for weeks. Her body shook with the effort of holding it back, terrified that the sound alone might earn punishment. But instead of anger, she felt his eyes on her. It was only a flicker, a glance so quick she could have imagined it. Yet the next morning she found a small paper packet resting on her bunk lozenges, rough but precious. No one admitted to leaving them. She knew, though, no one else would have bothered. Her fingers trembled as she held the packet, torn between suspicion and gratitude. Was it a trick? Was this another way to soften her before cruelty revealed itself? She whispered to herself that she would not be fooled, that she must remain strong. But that night, when the cough eased just enough for her to rest, she pressed the packet to her chest and felt her heart ache with a tenderness she did not want to name. In the following days, she watched him more closely, though she told herself it was only out of caution. When he called her name, his voice seemed to soften, even if she could not grasp the words. When the prisoners were led to the infirmary, he guided her gently, his hand steady but not forceful, ensuring she and 2 others received care before their sickness grew worse. She saw him linger in the corner of her vision, never intrusive, but never blind either. Unlike some guards who looked through the women as though they were invisible, his gaze carried weight, as if he truly saw them, not just as prisoners, not just as enemies, but as people. This realization unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. Cruelty was simple. It fit neatly into the stories she had carried from home, the warnings of officers, the lessons burned into her since childhood. But kindness, small, wordless, undeniable, was a threat to everything she thought she knew. Each time she caught his eyes on her, she looked away instantly, her cheeks burning with shame. She hated herself for noticing. She hated the way her breath quickened when his boots crunched the gravel nearby. She told herself she was weak, that she was betraying her homeland, her emperor, her very blood. And yet the truth was there, in her chest, pressing against her ribs until it hurt. One evening she carried laundry to the line, the sun hanging low, spilling gold across the camp. He stood at the fence, speaking casually with another soldier, his posture relaxed. When his eyes found hers, he stopped mid-sentence. For a single heartbeat, the world collapsed, the war, the hatred, the barbed wire between them. Her breath caught her hands, froze on the basket, and she tore her gaze away as though burned. That night, she could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his steady gaze, calm and human, lingering in her mind, like an ember refusing to die. She scolded herself for her weakness. She turned her face into the pillow and whispered curses at her own heart. But denial only sharpened the ache. In the darkness of the barracks, surrounded by women who murmured in their sleep, she pressed her hands over her chest as if she could quiet the storm within. The silence swallowed her words, leaving only the pounding of her heart. The next morning she tried harder than ever to ignore him. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her answers curt, and stiff her steps quick to avoid lingering near him. But even in her refusal, she was aware of his presence. The sound of his boots, the shadow of his figure, the faint timbre of his voice, each one reached her like a hand she dared not grasp. She told herself she despised it, despised him, despised the way her body betrayed her loyalty with every stolen glance. And yet when the interpreter spoke, she found herself straining to catch his tone beneath the translation, listening for the warmth she could not explain. The struggle consumed her. Her mind screamed loyalty, warning, duty, but her heart whispered questions she could not silence. What if kindness was not always deception? What if the enemy was not the monster she had been told? The thought terrified her more than the war itself, because if it were true, then everything she had built her life upon was already crumbling. In those days, Aiko learned that silence could be louder than shouts, that a glance could wound deeper than a weapon. She stood in the camp, bound by wire and watchtowers, yet her prison was no longer only of iron and fence. It was inside her, where belief and doubt collided, tearing her apart with every breath. And at the center of that storm was a soldier whose name she did not yet know, but whose presence was already rewriting the boundaries of her world. The shift came so quietly that Aiko almost convinced herself it wasn't happening. Days had blended into one another, marked by roll calls and work details, by the endless rhythm of footsteps and shouted commands. She had tried to ignore him, to push away the warmth that unsettled her more than the cold steel of the gates. But fate has a way of seeping through the smallest cracks. It began with a scrap of paper no larger than her palm slipped beside her sewing basket one afternoon when the guards delivered uniforms. She did not see it fall. She only felt her pulse quicken when her fingers brushed against the folded edge hidden among the fabric. Her breath caught, and the room seemed to tilt. She did not dare open it until night fell and the barracks settled into restless silence. Beneath her thin blanket, with hands trembling, she unfolded the paper. 3 words scratched in pencil, rough but careful. "Do you read?" Her heart slammed against her ribs. The question was absurd, simple, almost childish. Yet it was a bridge thrown across a chasm she had never dared approach. She whispered the words to herself, tasting them in halting English, ashamed of how much she remembered from school before the war forbade such things. She pressed the paper to her chest, torn between fear and the faintest flicker of hope. It was dangerous, reckless beyond measure. But it was also undeniable. Someone had reached for her, and she could not pretend she had not felt it. The next day, she found her answer. She carried buckets of water across the yard, her feet sinking in the dust. Near the fence where he stood on duty, she stumbled deliberately, bending to gather the handle. With the motion of someone desperate not to be seen, she tucked her own scrap of paper beneath a stone at the post. 1 word, shaky but clear. Yes. All afternoon she felt her stomach twist with dread, certain she had doomed herself. Every shout from a guard sent fire racing up her spine. Every glance from another prisoner felt like an accusation. Yet when she returned the following morning, the stone was bare. The note was gone. From then on, silence no longer belonged to her alone. It was shared. Days later, a battered English primer appeared under her folded linens, as if by accident. Her hands trembled as she opened it, pages yellowed, margins scribbled with faint pencil notes. Between the lines of vocabulary, small translations had been written, fragments of Japanese to guide her. She traced them with her fingertip, her lips shaping words she barely remembered. When the book disappeared for a day and returned, new notes had been added, short sentences, broken grammar, but unmistakably his. For the first time since the war began, learning felt like breathing. The language became their secret passageway, the thin thread binding them across the gulf of wire and silence. She answered clumsily, penciling her own words into the margins. A phrase in broken English, a question, a memory disguised as a translation. Each time the book returned, her heart leapt. Sometimes he corrected her. Other times he simply underlined her words, leaving them there like a treasure he had touched. Once she wrote, "Your sky is big. My home sky was small." When the book came back, his reply rested beside her line. Same sky, different home. She stared at the words until her vision blurred with tears. But secrets do not remain invisible forever. In the barracks, whispers began to stir. Other women noticed the way her eyes strayed during roll call, the way she clutched the book too tightly. Some said nothing, their silence heavy as judgment. Others muttered warnings in the dark, their voices sharp with fear. If the guards suspected, punishment would be swift. Aiko tried to bury the feelings sprouting inside her, but like weeds in a forgotten field, they grew no matter how hard she pulled at them. The danger became flesh, in the form of Private Harris, a guard whose eyes lingered too long, whose sneer cut deeper than words. She noticed him watching, not with kindness, but with suspicion. One afternoon she heard her own name in his mouth, sharp and ugly, as he spoke with the one she had come to know only through scraps of paper and soft gazes. She did not understand the English, not all of it, but she recognized the tone, accusation, threat. Her blood ran cold. That night she lay awake, the book pressed to her chest, the whispers of the barracks swirling around her. Her heart waged war against itself. One half screamed at her to stop, to burn the scraps, to erase the words before they destroyed her. The other half clung desperately to them because within those fragile pages was the only part of her life that felt alive. She whispered into the darkness, voice breaking, "This is madness." But the silence gave her no answer. Only her own pulse hammering in her ears, reminding her that madness and survival often wear the same face. The next day he slipped another note, hurried, rough, barely legible. "Careful eyes on us." Her throat tightened as she read it, hidden beneath her sleeve. Fear dug its claws into her, but even then she could not turn away. Each stolen glance became sharper, heavier, burning with the weight of discovery. Every nod across the yard felt like a confession. Every twitch of a smile threatened to unravel them both. And still she could not stop, because within those fleeting moments, Aiko felt the walls of her captivity tremble. Within the scrawled words and secret glances, she found something war had tried to erase, Her own humanity reflected back at her. It was fragile, forbidden, and doomed from the start. But it was real. And for a woman who had lost everything, real was worth any risk. The quiet thread that had carried Aiko through the long days began to fray under the weight of eyes that were not meant to see. Until now, she had lived in a fragile balance, silent exchanges hidden in the margins of a book, fleeting glances that spoke louder than words, secret notes that burned in her hands, like forbidden fire. But balance is never permanent in a place where every movement is watched. It was inevitable that someone else would notice. And when it happened, it came in the form of Private Harris. He was different from the others. Where most guards performed their duty with a detached professionalism, Harris seemed to relish the power of his uniform. His gaze was sharp, cutting the kind that made her stomach twist when she realized it lingered too long. She caught him watching once, then again his eyes narrowing whenever Miller's shadow passed too near her. At first, she convinced herself it was nothing, that her guilt was playing tricks on her. But denial could not hold forever. Harris's sneer gave him away. He had seen something, and suspicion bloomed like a poison in the air. Every moment afterward felt heavier. When she walked across the yard, her shoulders stiffened under the weight of unseen judgment. When Miller's eyes brushed hers, she forced herself to look away quickly, and terrified the glance might betray them both. The book that had once been her treasure now felt like a blade hidden under her pillow, precious but deadly if discovered. At night, she held it to her chest and whispered prayers she had long abandoned, begging the shadows to swallow their secret whole. Yet desire has a way of pulling stronger than fear. One evening, the prisoners were tasked with carrying baskets of vegetables from the camp garden. The air was thick with the scent of soil, the sun dipping low, staining the sky in streaks of crimson. Her hands trembled as she lifted her basket, her eyes flicking to the fence, where Miller stood. For days she had denied herself even a glance, but tonight exhaustion and longing overcame her restraint. Their eyes met. It was a brief collision, but it was enough to loosen something inside her chest. And in that fragile pause, she forgot the world. Then a shadow shifted. Harris stood not far behind Miller, his face tilted, his expression unreadable. Aiko's blood ran cold. She stumbled, the basket tumbling from her grip, carrots scattering across the dirt. She bent to gather them, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold them. When she dared to look up again, Harris's mouth curved into the faintest smile, a smile that was not kindness but warning. That night, Aiko could not breathe. She pressed the book so tightly against her chest that the edges bit into her skin. She whispered to herself in broken English words she had practiced in secret. Dangerous, watch, silence. Her heart pounded with the weight of them. Each syllable tasted like despair. She thought of burning the scraps, of tearing the pages, of severing the fragile bridge before it collapsed on both their heads. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Miller's steady gaze, the quiet warmth that had become her anchor in a sea of uncertainty. To destroy that was to destroy herself. The next morning, Harris's presence pressed closer. During roll call, she felt his eyes scrape over her like knives. When Miller's voice called her name softer than the others, she dared not raise her eyes. The interpreter's translation fell flat in her ears. Fear consumed every sound, every movement. She had never felt so trapped, not by the fences, not by the wire, but by the invisible net of suspicion tightening around her. It was late afternoon when the danger nearly broke them. She had been assigned to scrub pans in the kitchen, her hands raw from the endless scouring. The room smelled of soap and metal, the windows fogged from steam. The door creaked open and she glanced up to see Miller step inside carrying a bundle of supplies. Her breath caught her heart, leaping against her will. He moved with the same casual stride, his eyes scanning the room, and for a moment their gazes collided. It was only a heartbeat, but it was too long, too sharp, too revealing. A noise behind them broke the silence, a cough, a shift of boots against the floor. Aiko's eyes darted toward the doorway. Harris stood there, leaning casually against the frame, his smirk curling with something darker than amusement. The world tilted, and Aiko's hands slipped the pan crashing into the water with a sharp clang that echoed like a gunshot. Her chest seized panic flooding her veins. Miller's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to Harris with a warning that carried no words. He set the supplies down, gave a short command to the interpreter, and left as if nothing had happened. But the damage had been done. Harris had seen the glance, the falter, the trembling hands. He had seen enough. When night fell, Aiko lay awake in her bunk, her body frozen with terror. The other women breathed softly around her, but their whispers seemed louder than ever. She imagined their eyes watching, their voices muttering that she was betraying her country, betraying them all. She pressed her palms to her face and wept silently, the sound swallowed by the wooden beams above. Later, when she lifted her thin blanket, a small scrap of paper slipped from its fold. Her fingers shook as she opened it. The pencil strokes hurried, uneven. "Careful eyes on us." Her throat tightened, tears spilling freely now. He knew. He had seen the danger too. And still he reached for her. The weight of that note was almost unbearable. Each letter carved into her heart with equal parts fear and longing. Their secret, once fragile but sweet, had become a knife balanced on the edge of discovery. One slip, one glance too long, and it would cut them both. And yet, even as dread wrapped around her, she pressed the note to her lips, whispering the words she could not say aloud. "I cannot stop." Because within that madness, within that impossible risk, lay the only part of herself that still felt alive. The storm came without warning, rolling in from the horizon, like an army of its own. The Texas sky darkened to a bruised purple winds tearing across the fields with a howl that drowned out the usual order of the camp. Aiko stood among the other prisoners in the yard, her thin clothes whipped against her body, her hair lashing her face. Shouts rang out as guards hurried to corral them toward shelter, their voices lost in the roar of the storm. Rain began to fall, sudden and violent, each drop striking her skin like stones. She clutched the basket she had been carrying, its contents spilling as the downpour turned the dirt beneath her feet into a river of mud. Lightning split the sky, a jagged crack of white that lit the wire fences and watchtowers in a ghostly glow. Thunder followed so loud it shook the air from her lungs. She stumbled, her knees sinking into the muck, her hands clawing at the earth for balance. The world became a blur of water and chaos, women screaming as guards shouted, boots sliding across the soaked ground. Aiko felt the basket torn from her grip, her body pitched forward. For a moment she thought she would fall face first into the mud, swallowed whole by the storm. Then hands caught her strong, steady, pulling her upright. Her breath hitched as she looked up through the rain, and there he was, Daniel. His uniform plastered to his frame, his face shadowed by the downpour yet unmistakable. For a heartbeat the storm receded. She no longer heard the shouting, the thunder, the panic around them. All she saw were his eyes steady and human, locking onto hers with a force that rooted her to the earth. His grip lingered firm, but not forceful, his hand warm even through the icy rain. Aiko's chest tightened, her breath shallow, as if the entire world had collapsed into that single touch. Her heart hammered with confusion and fear, and something deeper, something she dared not name. She wanted to pull away, to shield herself from the danger of the moment, yet she could not. His hand anchored her in a storm that had no mercy, a reminder that she was not alone. Around them, chaos raged. Guards shouted orders, women huddled against the wind. The shed doors slammed open and shut with the force of the gale. But in that narrow space of breath and heartbeat, the war seemed to vanish. There were no sides, no uniforms, no wire fences, only a man holding a woman steady against the storm. Aiko's vision blurred not from the rain but from tears that mingled with it. She bit down hard on her lip, trying to steady the trembling inside her. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes held hers long enough for her to feel the words that neither could speak. Then, as if the world remembered itself, a guard shouted nearby, and Daniel released her quickly, his hands falling to his sides as though nothing had happened. She staggered back, her body still quaking, the ghost of his touch burning into her skin. He turned away, his posture once again the rigid mask of a soldier barking commands to move the women toward shelter. But Aiko knew what had happened, knew what had passed between them in that single forbidden moment. Inside the barracks that night, the storm continued to hammer the roof, rattling the windows with each gust of wind. The women whispered about the chaos, about the guards, about the baskets left behind in the mud. But Aiko heard none of it. She sat on her cot, her hands pressed to her lap, her body trembling with the memory of his touch. She stared at her palms as though they carried the shape of his grip, her breath catching each time the thunder rolled. She told herself it had meant nothing, that he had only been doing his duty, that he would have caught anyone who stumbled. Yet deep inside, she knew it wasn't true. His eyes had betrayed him, so had hers. Guilt crashed over her, like another wave of the storm. She thought of her mother, her brother of Japan, burning under American bombs. She thought of the emperor, of loyalty, of duty. And then she thought of the way Daniel's hand had steadied her, the warmth that had spread through her chest, even as rain froze her skin. She buried her face in her blanket, sobs choking her throat. She was a prisoner of war, he was her guard. Nothing could be more impossible, yet nothing had ever felt more real. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the camp drenched and silent, the earth soaked and heavy with the scent of wet soil. But inside Aiko, the storm raged on. She moved through the motions of the day, in a haze, her body obeying commands, even as her mind replayed the moment over and over. Each time her eyes met his from a distance, her stomach twisted, her chest burned. She tried to look away, but the memory clung to her like a second skin. It was madness. It was everything she had sworn to resist. And yet in that fleeting instant when his hand caught hers, the war had dissolved and she had glimpsed something beyond it. For the first time, since the clang of the gates had sealed her fate, Aiko felt not just fear, not just survival, but life, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. The news arrived like a blade that cut through the air of the camp. Rumors had already been swirling for weeks, Germany's surrender bombs falling on distant cities, whispers that Japan was crumbling under firestorms. But when the announcement came on August 15th, it was undeniable. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. For some the words were a release, for others a wound that would never heal. For Aiko, they were both at once. She felt her chest tighten as though she had been torn in two. Relief surged through her veins. Relief that the killing would end, that perhaps her family might still be alive. Yet grief clawed just as fiercely. Everything she had believed in, everything she had endured for, had collapsed in a single stroke of silence. The camp shifted overnight. Guards who had once been shadows of authority now spoke with subdued tones. The prisoners gathered in clusters, some weeping, others staring blankly at the horizon, as though trying to glimpse their homeland across the miles. Aiko walked among them, the English primer pressed against her chest, her knuckles white around its battered cover. It had become her lifeline, her secret, her confession. She knew that soon it would be time to let go. The morning of departure came with gray skies. The prisoners lined up, bundles clutched in their arms, the air heavy with the weight of farewells. Trucks rumbled at the edge of the yard, their engines coughing, ready to carry them to the ships that would take them back across the ocean. Aiko stood stiff, her eyes scanning the crowd, desperate and terrified to see him. For a moment she thought he would not come, that the world had swallowed him before she could find the courage to say goodbye. Then she saw him, Daniel, standing at the far edge of the yard, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. His face betrayed nothing but his eyes. His eyes found hers and held them as though they had been waiting all along. Her throat tightened, words dying before they could form. She wanted to run to him, to reach across the gulf of soldiers and fences, but she could not. The risk was too great. The war might have ended, but its rules still bound them. Instead, she reached into her sleeve and pulled out the primer, its pages worn thin, its margins filled with the fragile bridge they had built together. She held it just enough for him to see. For the briefest moment, his lips curved, not into a smile, not fully, but into the ghost of one. It was enough. As the truck jolted forward, Aiko pressed the book against her chest, tears sliding silently down her face. She did not wave. He did not move. Yet the promise lingered in the space between them, as real and binding as any vow. The voyage home was long and cruel. The sea was rough, the air heavy with salt and sickness. Aiko lay awake at night, her body rocked by the waves, her heart clinging to the memory of his steady eyes. When she stepped onto Japanese soil again, her knees nearly buckled. The land she returned to was not the home she had carried in her heart. Tokyo lay in ruins. Whole neighborhoods had been burned to ash. She found her house reduced to rubble, her mother gone in the firebombings, her younger brother vanished without word. Only an aunt remained, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow with grief. Life became survival once more. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, the streets lined with despair. Yet even amid ruin, Aiko carried her secret flame. At night, she opened the primer, tracing the words in the margins with her fingertips, whispering the English phrases she had learned in stolen silence. Same sky, different home. Not enemy, not you. Those words became her anchor, her prayer. Years passed. Japan rebuilt itself brick by brick, scar by scar. Aiko found work as a translator, her English sharpened by the very book that had once been contraband. People called her strong, resilient, but they did not know that her strength came from a promise whispered across barbed wire. She never spoke of it. She never told anyone of the soldier who had changed the shape of her captivity, who had steadied her in a storm. The world would not have understood, but she knew. 7 years later, in the spring of 1952, a letter arrived. The envelope bore an American stamp, the handwriting rough but familiar enough to make her hands tremble before she even broke the seal. Inside, in clumsy strokes, were the words that made her knees give way. Aiko, I keep my promise. James. Her breath caught her vision, blurred the room, spinning as she clutched the letter to her chest. There was more, a photograph grainy and small of him in civilian clothes, his smile shy but unmistakable. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she pressed the paper to her lips. The war had taken nearly everything from her, her family, her home, her innocence. Yet against all odds, it had given her this, a flame that no propaganda, no wire, no ruin could ever extinguish. In that moment, she understood what had carried her through the darkest nights. Not survival alone, but the promise of a hand that had once caught hers, and a storm of eyes that had seen her not as prisoner or enemy but as a woman. The war was over. The fences were gone. But the vow remained alive, in the ink of a letter, in the trembling of her hands, in the fire she carried within. And for the first time in years, Aiko allowed herself to believe that some promises could outlast even war. History is not only written in treaties, battles, or the ruins of cities, it is also written in the fragile bonds that defy war itself. Aiko's journey from the clang of the camp gates to the silent farewell on the day of repatriation reminds us that even in the darkest of times, humanity finds a way to surface. Through small gestures, secret notes, and a single hand reaching through a storm, she discovered that compassion could survive barbed wire and propaganda. Her story is not about victory or defeat. It is about the survival of dignity, the resilience of the human spirit, and the quiet power of promises that outlast empires. As we reflect on her tale, we are reminded that history is not a distant museum piece, but a living echo that still shapes who we are today. The tension between duty and desire, between hatred taught and kindness discovered, is not unique to Aiko's world. It belongs to every era where conflict seeks to erase humanity. And it is in those moments when ordinary people risk seeing one another beyond the labels of enemy or other that history becomes most alive. But how many other stories like this lie hidden in dusty archives, waiting to be rediscovered? How many silent promises, stolen glances, or fragile acts of defiance have been lost to time, erased by official records that favored numbers and dowry? Battles over human hearts. This is where your curiosity matters. Each story like Aiko's opens a door, asking us to step closer, to question what we thought we knew, to imagine the lives lived between the lines of history books. So I want to hear from you. What do you feel when you hear about Aiko's story? Do you believe such forbidden bonds should be remembered alongside battles and treaties? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective shapes how these stories live on. And if you want to continue exploring these hidden fragments of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Every interaction helps bring forgotten voices back into the light. And remember, this is only one account among countless others. There are letters buried in old trunks, diaries, locked away testimonies scattered across time. Each one holds secrets that challenge what we think we know about war, loyalty, and love. The question is, are you ready to uncover them? Stay with us, because the next story may take you deeper into the shadows of history, where another unexpected truth waits to be found.